I knew the HOA had it out for me, but I never thought they'd go this far. It started early in the morning when I stepped outside with my coffee, ready to enjoy the crisp lakeside air. Instead, I nearly dropped my mug. A massive semi-truck was parked right across my driveway, blocking my only way in or out. I clenched my jaw and marched toward it, my boots crunching against the gravel. The truck wasn't just blocking the driveway, it was parked so close to my garage that I couldn't even open it. That's when I heard the high-pitched voice I had come to despise. "Good morning, Isaac," Margaret Stokes, the HOA president, called out, strutting up my driveway like she owned the place. Her short, overly highlighted hair was stiff with hairspray, and her expression was smug as ever. "What the hell is this, Margaret?" I asked, gesturing to the truck. She folded her arms. "Oh, just enforcing HOA regulations. You've been warned multiple times about the unsightly state of your property, and the board has decided that action needed to be taken." Unsightly? I nearly laughed. I kept my property in perfect shape, the lawn trimmed, the house freshly painted, and the driveway clean. The real issue was that Margaret and her little band of HOA cronies didn't like that I refused to bow to their nonsense rules. "This is illegal," I said, stepping closer. "You can't just block my driveway." "Oh, but we can," she said, tilting her nose up. "You've refused to comply with HOA orders, so we've hired a contractor to begin corrective measures. This truck is here to make sure everything gets done." I narrowed my eyes. What corrective measures? Margaret waved a dismissive hand. "The board has approved landscaping changes to bring your property up to standard. You'll be getting a new fence and that ugly shed in the back. It's being removed." I felt my blood pressure spike. "You don't have the authority to do that. My shed is on private property, and my fence was approved when I moved in." She gave me an infuriating smile. "Well, the board has reconsidered." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. "Move the truck." Margaret shook her head. "Not until we finish our work." I pulled my phone out of my pocket. "Fine, I'll call a tow truck." She actually laughed. "Oh, Isaac, you're adorable. This truck belongs to a contractor we hired. You try to tow it and you'll be interfering with HOA business. That could lead to fines or even legal action." I stared at her, my grip tightening around my phone. They thought they had me cornered. They thought they could bully me into submission. What Margaret didn't know was that I had already been preparing for their next stunt. And this time I wasn't the one who was cornered. I turned on my heel and walked back inside, ignoring her smug laughter behind me. I had one call to make. Because what Margaret also didn't know. The police were already watching. I stepped inside and shut the door, breathing out slowly to keep my temper in check. The smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air, but I had no time to enjoy it. Instead, I pulled out my phone and dialed the number I had saved weeks ago, knowing this day would come. The call was answered on the second ring. "Detective Holloway." "It's Isaac, they're doing it," I said, keeping my voice controlled. "The HOA blocked my driveway with a semi-truck and are claiming they're making corrective changes to my property without permission." There was a brief pause before Holloway responded, his tone edged with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for this moment. "I was hoping they'd be this bold." Weeks ago, after numerous incidents with Margaret and her goons, I had started documenting everything, every letter, every violation notice, every absurd claim they made. But when they escalated their tactics from ridiculous fines to outright harassment, I had taken it a step further. I reached out to Detective Holloway, an old friend who had been investigating a fraud case involving corrupt HOA boards in the area. Turns out, my neighborhood was on his list. "Stay inside," Holloway continued. "We're already set up nearby. This confirms exactly what we needed. I'll be there in 5. I hung up and glanced out the window. Margaret was still in my driveway, speaking with a man in a neon vest, probably the so-called contractor she'd hired. She was gesturing toward my backyard, likely plotting the removal of my shed. I took a deep breath and let a slow smile spread across my face. She had no idea what was coming. Minutes later, I heard the unmistakable sound of sirens. Not one, but 2 patrol cars turned onto my street, their lights flashing as they pulled up in front of my house. The smug expression on Margaret's face vanished when she saw them. I stepped outside just as Detective Holloway and 2 uniformed officers exited their vehicles. Margaret quickly composed herself, putting on the same condescending air she always did when she thought she was in control. "Officers, what seems to be the problem?" She gestured toward me. "If this is about Mr. Carter's complaints, I can assure you everything being done here is well within the HOA's rights." Holloway didn't even acknowledge her at first. He walked straight up to me, shaking my hand firmly before turning his gaze toward the semi-truck still blocking my driveway. "That truck yours, Mr. Carter?" Holloway asked. "No," I said. "It was parked here this morning by a contractor hired by the HOA." Margaret let out a forced laugh. "As I said, Detective, this is official HOA business. We." Holloway finally looked at her, cutting her off. "You're Margaret Stokes, correct?" She blinked in surprise. "Yes, I am. As president of the HOA, I oversee all community regulations and enforce them accordingly." Holloway pulled out a small notepad. "Interesting, because we've been investigating multiple complaints regarding your HOA's practices, and this little stunt just confirmed a lot of what we suspected." Margaret's confident demeanor wavered. "I don't know what you're insinuating, but—" One of the uniformed officers walked over to the semi-truck, inspecting its tires and the way it was positioned. "This vehicle is blocking a private driveway and obstructing access to the homeowner's property," the officer said. "That's against county regulations." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not obstruction if it's part of an authorized HOA project." Holloway raised an eyebrow. "Authorized by whom? Because according to county records, Mr. Carter's property is not under any active work permits. In fact, any modifications to his property without his consent would be considered trespassing and destruction of private property." The color drained from Margaret's face. "Now, Detective, let's not be dramatic. We were simply making improvements." "Improvements," Holloway repeated flatly. "Without the homeowner's consent, without legal authorization, that sounds more like property tampering to me." The officer near the truck turned toward us. "We'll need to get this vehicle moved immediately," he said. "If it's not moved voluntarily, we'll have to tow it." Margaret bristled. "You can't tow a contractor's vehicle while they're on the job." Holloway let out a dry chuckle. "You really want to play this game?" He turned to the officer. "Call it in. If no one moves the truck in the next 5 minutes, have it towed at the HOA's expense." Margaret's jaw tightened, and she quickly turned to the contractor she had been speaking with earlier. "Move the truck," she snapped, her voice no longer carrying the same fake politeness. The man hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. "But ma'am, we were supposed to." "Now," she hissed through clenched teeth. The contractor muttered something under his breath and walked toward the truck. Moments later, the engine rumbled to life, and the massive vehicle began reversing down the street. Holloway watched with satisfaction before turning back to Margaret. "Now let's talk about the other issues," he said. "We've received multiple reports of your HOA issuing fraudulent fines, attempting unauthorized changes to properties, and in some cases threatening legal action without proper cause." Margaret squared her shoulders, trying to regain control. "I don't know where you're getting this information, but I assure you, the HOA operates within all legal guidelines." Holloway pulled a folder from his jacket, flipping it open. "Then you won't mind explaining why your HOA has been collecting additional fees from homeowners for special projects that were never completed, or why certain fines were issued without any supporting documentation." Margaret's mouth opened, but no words came out. "Better yet," Holloway continued, "you can explain it down at the station. Because based on everything we've gathered, there's enough here to warrant a formal investigation into financial misconduct." Margaret's face twisted in panic. "This is outrageous, you can't just—" Holloway turned to the two uniformed officers. "Escort Ms. Stokes to the station for further questioning." One of the officers stepped forward, motioning for Margaret to follow. She hesitated, glancing around as if expecting someone to intervene, but the neighbors had started gathering on the sidewalk, watching the spectacle unfold. No one was coming to her rescue. Margaret's shoulders slumped, and without another word she followed the officers to the patrol car. As the door shut behind her, I finally allowed myself to breathe. Holloway turned back to me, a knowing smile on his face. "I think your HOA troubles just got a lot smaller." I exhaled, glancing at the neighbors who were murmuring amongst themselves. Some of them had been afraid to push back against the HOA, worried about retaliation. But now they had seen the truth. This was the beginning of the end for Margaret and her corrupt little empire. And I had a feeling my neighborhood was about to change for the better. As the patrol car carrying Margaret disappeared down the road, a hush fell over the gathered neighbors. Some exchanged glances, murmuring amongst themselves. Others simply stood in stunned silence as if they couldn't quite believe what had just happened. The iron grip of the HOA had finally cracked, and people were trying to process what it meant. Holloway slipped his notepad back into his pocket and turned to me. His sharp eyes held a glint of satisfaction, but his tone remained measured. "You should expect some fallout from this," he said. "Margaret might be the loudest, but she's not the only one pulling strings. The rest of the board will scramble to cover their tracks now that she's under investigation." I nodded, already expecting as much. Margaret might have been the face of the HOA's corruption, but there were others behind the scenes who had enabled her for years. They weren't going to give up power without a fight. One of my neighbors, a man named Dave Bennett, stepped forward. His usual wary expression was replaced with something closer to cautious relief. "Isaac," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "I had no idea things were this bad. I mean, I knew the HOA was out of control, but I never thought they'd actually try to take over someone's property like that." A few others murmured in agreement. "They've been getting worse," I said, "but some of us saw it coming. This wasn't about enforcing community rules, it was about control." A woman in her 60s, Mrs. Thompson, folded her arms. "They fined me 3 times last year for violations that didn't exist. I paid because I didn't want them harassing me, but now I'm wondering how much of that money went into their pockets." Another neighbor, a younger man named Lewis, clenched his jaw. "They tried to make me repaint my house even though I had already gotten approval for the color. Said I had to pay a new assessment fee to keep the original approval valid." The pieces were falling into place. The HOA had been running a well-oiled scam for years, draining money from the community under the guise of enforcement. And they had gotten away with it because no one had dared to push back. Until now. Holloway studied the group, then glanced at me. "This is your chance," he said quietly. "People are listening now. If you want real change, you need to act fast before the rest of the board tries to sweep this under the rug." He was right. If we didn't take action, the remaining board members would close ranks and try to keep their hold on the neighborhood. I turned to the neighbors, raising my voice so everyone could hear. "We need to do more than just watch Margaret go down for this. The rest of the board allowed this to happen. They let her intimidate homeowners, issue fraudulent fines, and misuse our HOA funds. If we don't do something now, they'll just replace her with someone just as bad." Dave frowned. "What are you suggesting?" "We organize," I said. "We demand a full financial audit of the HOA's records. We vote to remove the rest of the board. And we make sure that whoever replaces them is actually working for the community, not against it." Mrs. Thompson nodded. "I like the sound of that, but how do we make it happen?" Lewis crossed his arms. "A recall vote. The bylaws allow homeowners to remove board members if there's enough support. We just need a petition with signatures from a majority of the residents." Holloway nodded approvingly. "If you get that going, I can make sure the investigation keeps the pressure on them. Once the financial records come into play, a lot of things will unravel." A buzz of excitement spread through the crowd. People who had been too afraid to speak up before were suddenly energized. "I'll help with the petition," Dave said. "I know plenty of people who would sign." "I'll talk to the neighbors on my street," Mrs. Thompson added. One by one, people stepped forward, volunteering to help. The fear that Margaret and her cronies had instilled in them for years was finally starting to lift. As the group began making plans, I glanced toward the lake. The morning sun had risen higher, casting golden reflections over the water. The HOA had ruled this neighborhood with an iron fist for too long. But now, standing among my neighbors as they took their first steps toward reclaiming their community, I knew that change was finally coming. And this time, the board wouldn't see it coming. With the neighbors energized and the petition already gaining traction, I knew we had momentum. But I also knew the remaining HOA board members wouldn't go down without a fight. Margaret had been the face of the corruption, but she wasn't the only one benefiting from it. Now that she was in police custody, the others would be scrambling to cover their tracks. I needed to move fast. As the crowd began breaking off into smaller groups, discussing who would gather signatures from which streets, I stepped away and pulled out my phone. There was one more person I needed to call. The line rang twice before a voice answered, gruff but familiar. "Isaac, I was wondering when I'd hear from you." "Hey Tom, we've got a situation." Tom Reynolds was a retired attorney who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years. He had once been on the HOA board himself, back when it had actually functioned to help the community rather than exploit it. But he had resigned a decade ago when Margaret and her group had taken control, refusing to be part of what he called their power-hungry little empire. I quickly filled him in on what had happened that morning: the semi-truck, the police, Margaret's arrest, and the petition we were organizing. When I finished, there was a pause before Tom exhaled sharply. Finally, he said, I warned them years ago that their greed would catch up to them, but they got careless, didn't they? They thought they were untouchable, I said. But now that the board is exposed, they're going to do everything they can to keep their grip on the neighborhood. Tom let out a low chuckle. And that's where they've already lost. They spent years intimidating people into silence, but now you've given the community a reason to fight back. That's something they can't control. I glanced back at the neighbors, who were still talking in hushed but determined voices. He was right. The fear that had once kept people compliant was gone. But here's the problem, I said. We don't just need to remove the board, we need to make sure they can't manipulate things from behind the scenes once they're out. I need your help. Tom didn't hesitate. I'm in. First, we need to make sure this petition is airtight. HOA bylaws can be tricky, and I don't trust them not to find some loophole to invalidate it. Send me a copy, and I'll make sure it holds up legally. I nodded, already pulling up the document on my phone. Done. What else? Financial records, Tom said. If Holloway's investigating them, there's a high chance they've been mishandling funds. We need to push for a full audit before they can destroy any evidence. That means filing a formal request with the county and possibly getting a court order if they resist. I clenched my jaw. They're definitely going to resist. Then we make sure they can't, Tom said. Margaret might be gone, but the others are already scheming. I'll start drafting the paperwork. In the meantime, keep gathering signatures. The more support you have, the harder it'll be for them to fight back. I ended the call, feeling a renewed sense of determination. The board had spent years abusing their power, thinking no one would ever challenge them. But they had underestimated the very people they had been controlling. And now they were about to lose everything. By the next afternoon, the petition had gathered more than enough signatures. People were signing faster than we could keep track, eager to rid themselves of the corrupt leadership that had plagued the community for years. Dave and Lewis had taken charge of organizing volunteers, ensuring every street was covered. Mrs. Thompson had recruited several longtime residents who had once been too afraid to speak up, but were now ready to take action. With the petition finalized, I called for a meeting at the community center. Normally, HOA meetings were dry, sparsely attended affairs where the board made decisions without much resistance, but this time was different. By the time I arrived, the room was packed. People who had never attended a meeting before were crammed into chairs and standing along the walls. Conversations buzzed in every corner, filled with frustration, determination, and most importantly, hope. I stepped onto the small stage at the front, clearing my throat. The room quieted. Thank you all for coming, I began. I know we've all had our share of run-ins with the HOA, but what happened yesterday made it clear that this isn't about enforcing rules or improving the neighborhood. This has been about control, about greed. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. I held up the petition. We have the signatures. This is our chance to remove the board and take back our community. Applause erupted, but I raised a hand to quiet them. But we need to be smart about this. They're going to fight back. They're going to try to discredit us, delay the vote, maybe even pull legal tricks to stay in power. That's why we're not just stopping at a recall vote. We're also demanding a full audit of the HOA's finances. Gasps and whispers spread through the room. Tom stepped forward. That's right, he said. For years, they've been collecting extra fees, issuing fines without justification, and funneling money into projects that never materialized. If they've been misusing funds, we'll find out, and if necessary, we'll take legal action. The energy in the room shifted. It was no longer just about removing the board, it was about holding them accountable. A man in the back stood up. What if they refuse to cooperate? I met his gaze. Then we make sure they don't have a choice. The meeting ended with a unanimous vote to proceed with both the recall and the audit. People left feeling more empowered than they had in years. But as I stepped outside, I spotted a familiar figure lingering near the parking lot. Gregory Langston, the HOA's vice president. Unlike Margaret, Gregory was quieter, more calculating. He had always been the one working behind the scenes, keeping the financial records buried under layers of bureaucracy. As I approached, he gave me a tight smile. Quite the show you put on in there, he said. I crossed my arms. It's not a show, it's the beginning of the end for your little operation. His smile didn't waver, but his eyes were cold. You think this is over just because Margaret's gone. You have no idea what you're getting into. I stepped closer, neither do you. For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. He took a step back, regaining his composure. We'll see about that, he said before turning and walking away. I watched him go, already knowing what his next move would be. The board wasn't going to go down quietly. But neither were we. The next morning I woke early, knowing the fight was far from over. The petition had shaken the remaining board members, but Gregory Langston wasn't the type to roll over. If anything, I expected him to come back swinging. I headed outside to check my property, half expecting some new attempt at harassment. But my driveway was clear, no trucks or surprise corrective measures waiting for me. The only sign of the previous day's events was the faint tire marks left by the semi-truck. The neighborhood, however, was buzzing. People who had once walked with their heads down, avoiding confrontation, now stopped to chat in driveways and on sidewalks. Conversations were more animated, filled with speculation about what would happen next. The fear Margaret had instilled was gone, replaced by something else: determination. I wasn't the only one who had noticed the shift. As I reached my mailbox, Dave jogged up, his phone in hand. His usual easygoing demeanor was replaced with urgency. "They're meeting right now," he said. "The board, emergency session, probably trying to figure out how to stop the recall." That was exactly what I'd expected. I gestured toward his phone. "Where?" "The clubhouse. A couple of us were thinking of going down there, but..." He hesitated, clearly torn between his desire to confront them and the risk of playing into their hands. "They'll just lock the doors and claim it's a private meeting," I said. "But if they're scrambling, that means we're winning." Dave nodded, glancing toward the clubhouse down the road. "So what now?" "They'll try to discredit the petition first," I said. "If that fails, they'll try to delay the recall vote. And if that doesn't work, they'll look for a legal loophole to keep themselves in power." Lewis had walked up by then, arms crossed. "We need to be ready for all of it." I already had a plan for that. Tom's working on getting an official audit request pushed through. If they think they can just wait this out, that'll change when investigators start digging into their finances. Dave let out a low whistle. "That'll put them in a corner real fast." "That's the idea," I said. "But before that, we need proof they're violating procedure with this emergency meeting." Lewis grinned. "I think I can help with that." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small recording device. I raised an eyebrow. "Where did you get that?" "My job requires me to document certain things," he said with a shrug. "And let's just say I've had a feeling something shady was going to happen." He didn't need to say more. If we could get proof that the board was conspiring to suppress the recall, it would make it a lot harder for them to fight back when we challenged them. "Let's take a walk," I said. The three of us strolled casually toward the clubhouse, doing our best to appear uninterested. We stopped near a bench just outside the meeting hall, close enough that Lewis could discreetly place the recorder near an open window. Voices carried through the gap, and I recognized Gregory's clipped tone immediately. "They're moving too fast," he said. "If we don't shut this down now, we'll be out by the end of the month." Someone else spoke, their voice tense. "We can reject the petition on a technicality, say they didn't follow proper submission protocols." Gregory scoffed. "That won't hold up. Reynolds probably made sure it was airtight. No, we need something stronger, something that makes them think twice about pushing forward." A third voice, lower and gruffer, spoke up. "What about fines? We still control enforcement. Start hitting them with violations. Make it public, make it ugly. If enough people get scared, they'll back off." My hands clenched into fists. So that was their play: scare the homeowners back into submission. Gregory hummed and thought. "That could work, but we need a bigger deterrent. What if we threaten legal action, claim they're damaging the HOA's reputation with baseless accusations?" Someone else scoffed. "Even if that works, what about the audit? If the county steps in, they'll see the financial discrepancies. We can't cover that up forever." A beat of silence followed before Gregory's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Then we make sure they never get the documents." Lewis shot me a glance, his expression dark. If Gregory was talking about destroying records, that meant they really were guilty of financial misconduct. We had heard enough. Lewis carefully retrieved the recorder and we walked away, keeping our pacing natural. As soon as we were out of earshot, Dave exhaled sharply. "They're really going for it." "They're cornered," I said, "and cornered people do desperate things." Lewis held up the recorder. "But now we have proof. They're actively trying to suppress the recall and destroy evidence. That's enough to escalate this legally." I nodded. "We take this to Holloway. If we can prove intent to tamper with financial records, this won't just be a recall vote, it'll be a criminal investigation." Dave let out a low chuckle. "Gregory's not going to see this coming." That was the point. By the time we reached my house, I had already called Holloway. He picked up on the first ring. "What do you have?" he asked. I didn't waste time. A recording. The board's planning to retaliate against homeowners with fines and threats, and Gregory just implied they're going to destroy financial records before the audit. Holloway's tone sharpened. "That's exactly what I needed. Send me the file, I'll get a warrant." I did as he asked, my pulse steady. The board had been playing a long game, manipulating homeowners and siphoning money under the radar. But now they had made a fatal mistake. They had spoken too freely, too arrogantly, and we had caught them in the act. Dave clapped me on the shoulder. "I think we just won." "Not yet," I said, "but we're close." Lewis grinned, "Close enough that Gregory's going to regret ever messing with your driveway." I allowed myself a small smile. The board had spent years thinking they were untouchable. Now they were about to find out what it felt like to be powerless. And this time it was their turn to be afraid. As soon as I sent the recording to Holloway, I knew the clock had started ticking. Gregory and the remaining board members weren't just running a corrupt HOA, they were about to commit outright fraud by destroying financial records. That meant Holloway needed to move fast, and we had to be ready for whatever desperate stunt they pulled next. I didn't bother waiting around. Lewis and Dave were already ahead of me, heading toward their cars. We needed eyes on the clubhouse before Gregory realized what was happening. If they started shredding documents or wiping computers, we had to catch them in the act. By the time we reached the clubhouse, the parking lot was nearly empty. Only Gregory's black SUV and another car, the treasurers, were parked near the side entrance. That told me everything I needed to know. Whatever they were doing inside, they didn't want an audience. Lewis knelt near the side of the building, his phone raised as he recorded through the slightly ajar office window. Inside, Gregory and the treasurer, a wiry man named Philip, were hunched over a desk piled with folders. A shredder buzzed as a steady stream of papers disappeared into its hungry maw. Lewis muttered under his breath, "They're actually doing it." Dave kept his voice low. "How long do you think we have before Holloway gets here?" "Not long," I said, "but long enough to make sure they don't get away with it." I pulled out my phone and dialed Holloway again. When he answered, I didn't waste time. "They're destroying financial records right now. We have it on video." Holloway's response was immediate. "Stay put. Officers are en route. Do not engage." I wasn't planning on it. Gregory was desperate, and desperate people did stupid things. But that didn't mean I was just going to stand there while they tried to erase years of corruption. I motioned for Lewis to keep filming as I stepped toward the front of the building. The door was locked, but that didn't matter. I knocked, loud enough to make sure they heard. Inside, the shredder stopped. A few seconds later, Gregory's voice rang out, sharp with irritation. "We're in a private session, HOA business." I knocked again, harder this time. "Open the door, Gregory." Silence. Then the sound of hurried movement, papers shuffling, a chair scraping backward. They were trying to hide the evidence before they had no choice but to let me in. I turned to Dave. "Go around back. If they try to slip out, stop them." He nodded and took off. Lewis kept his phone angled at the window, capturing every movement inside. Finally, the door cracked open just enough for Gregory's face to appear. He looked calm, but his eyes were calculating. "You have no authority to be here," he said. "This is an internal HOA matter." I kept my expression neutral. Destroying financial records isn't an HOA matter, it's a felony. Philip, standing just behind him, swallowed hard. He wasn't as good at hiding his nerves as Gregory was. Gregory didn't flinch. "I don't know what you think you saw, but unless you're here on official business, I suggest you leave." I crossed my arms. "Holloway on his way, he knows what you're doing." For the first time, Gregory's mask cracked. A flicker of panic flashed across his face before he forced it away. Behind him, Philip backed toward the desk, subtly trying to push a stack of papers out of sight, but Lewis had already recorded it all. Gregory exhaled sharply. "You're making a mistake, Isaac." "No, Gregory," I said, "you did, and now you're out of time." Before he could respond, the distant wail of sirens cut through the air. Gregory stiffened. Philip paled. I stepped back as two patrol cars pulled up, their lights flashing. Holloway was out of his car before it even fully stopped, his gaze locking onto Gregory like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "Step aside, Isaac," Holloway said. I did as he asked, watching as two uniformed officers pushed past Gregory and Philip, heading straight for the office. Gregory's composure shattered. "This is outrageous," he snapped. You have no right to. Holloway cut him off. We have a warrant. That shut him up. Philip, realizing there was no way out, visibly deflated. The officers didn't hesitate, they moved straight to the desk, pulling out the files Gregory had been trying to hide. One of them gestured toward the shredder. Bag it, the officer said. We'll recover what we can. Gregory's hands clenched into fists, but he didn't resist as Holloway turned to him. Gregory Langston, you're under investigation for tampering with financial records, obstruction of justice, and possible embezzlement of HOA funds. Philip let out a strangled noise. I didn't do anything. Gregory told me we were just reorganizing. Gregory turned on him, his voice sharp. Shut up, Philip. Holloway didn't seem surprised. You can tell your side of the story at the station. As the officers cuffed Gregory and led him toward the patrol car, the gathered neighbors murmured amongst themselves. Word had spread fast, and now a small crowd had formed, watching as the once untouchable HOA vice president was hauled away in disgrace. Philip, still shaking, was escorted separately. He wasn't in cuffs yet, but his chances of dodging consequences were slim. As Gregory was pushed into the back of the car, he turned to me, his eyes burning with fury. This isn't over, he hissed. I met his gaze without blinking. Yes, it is. The door slammed shut, cutting off whatever else he might have said. Holloway walked over, shaking his head. They really thought they could destroy the evidence before we got here. They got arrogant, I said. They thought they were above the law. Not anymore, Holloway said. Between the financial records we recovered and the recording you got, they're done. The HOA is finished. I exhaled, feeling the tension that had been building for months finally start to ease. Lewis clapped me on the back. We did it. Dave, grinning, crossed his arms. No more fines, no more harassment, no more corrupt HOA. The neighbors watched as the patrol cars pulled away, some cheering, others simply shaking their heads in disbelief. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was free. And as I turned back to my house, finally able to walk up my driveway without obstruction, I knew one thing for certain: this was how it should have always been.